I am your host, Nicole Will, and we thank you for joining us as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside elders, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversations. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the willGather podcast. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are so excited to welcome Renee Skoglund, our gerontologist that we love to have on our podcast. She is so insightful. She has been in the field for over 30 years with lots of insight and knowledge into our aging industry, focusing on creating, implementing, managing, and improving all these great programs for people over 50, and she is now the executive director at the Sanctuary in St. Cloud, a senior living building. Renee, welcome. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Nicole. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And we really thought it was important to touch on some listener questions that we got submitted, and thought there's no one better to ask those questions to than Renee. So I'm
Oh, thank
going
you.
to,
And I love listener questions. I think that's awesome. So
I know.
keep sending them in, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please send them in. You can go on our website and submit your questions and your emails, and we will take those and answer those and get back to you. Really, we love helping people, so honored to do it.
Definitely.
Okay, our listener wrote in and had a question that I think a lot of people are faced with when they have a loved one or an aging parent, and we are going to read their question. So, our listener had the question of, I need to know how to transition from my parents deciding everything on their own to me or my sister taking over. Losing independence is so hard. How do I know when to step in and when to let them struggle? So their loved one must be facing some different changes or challenges, and they are wanting to support them in that. And how do we answer this question, Renee?
Well, I'd love to talk to the person because there's so many things to unpack here. First of all, you're right. This is a question that a lot of families and caregivers are dealing with on a daily basis. And deciding on, there's lots of things to ask about this question. Is it dementia? Is it physical? Is it a mental illness? Those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Or is the person in danger versus they're just trying to make decisions? So not knowing any of those things, I'm going to speak fairly generally. And then if the person who wrote this question wants us to follow up, I'd be happy to do that.
That's great.
But, first of all, think about the focus of control. A couple of things that I wasn't sure about is deciding everything on their own. We don't want to take a whole decision-making process from somebody. Everybody wants to feel in control of their own life. It gives them satisfaction. It gives them purpose and meaning in their life. And so making sure that you're not just taking every decision out of their hands, I think, is important. So, for example, let's say somebody is having trouble with their finances. Can you sit down together with you and your sister and your parents to go through it together instead of just saying, I'm taking over the finances because you can't do it anymore? So I think there's a way to do it that's not being demeaning, not just taking their independence away, those kinds of things, because finances are usually one of those issues. Somebody gets scammed and all of a sudden, oh, we're going to take the finances away. And again, like we've talked about before, if your parents were in their 50s, would you be having the same conversation?
Right.
So if you get scammed in your 50s, does that mean my 20-year-old son should be taking my finances away? Probably not.
Yeah.
But
And when do we, and that's what's interesting is when does that mindset or threshold change that opinion?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But on the other hand, it's knowledge is power. And sometimes the things that you want to ask your loved ones are usually too late. when they're either gone or can't physically or mentally answer those questions for you. So having a family discussion about how the finances are run, what kind of things do you want to happen with your health care if you're not able to talk for yourself? Do you want somebody to go to the doctor with your parents or your loved ones every once in a while, so you have a full array of knowledge going in and saying, okay, these are the things we need to do. These are the things we need to support you in making sure your life has quality and meaning and purpose without taking everything from you and making sure that you're just, existing. Because just existing is not a high quality of life.
No. And so it's really being proactive in a way to having the conversations ahead of time when you're not in crisis.
Exactly.
And so if
crisis is a horrible time to do things.
It is. And so possibly one thought I had is if we're talking about helping make decisions about, let's say, one particular issue, would that be the time then to say, well, let's discuss all of these other components now, so we can have a plan before we are going to need to react to that.
Right. Exactly. I kind of go back to finances again, but to say, okay, who else's name is going to be on the checking account? Because if something happens, you should be able to get in there. I actually put my son's name on my checking account, and I'm in my 50s, but I thought how frustrating for him if he needs something and something happens to me, he couldn't get into there. So, just like you said, Nicole, being proactive and discussing things before a crisis begins is key.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I'm an only child, but if others are involved in your loved one's life, who's going to be doing what and how does that look? How can you make decisions together to say, okay, I'm going to take this piece and you take this piece and you work with mom and dad on this part and I'll work with them on that part. So nobody's bearing the whole load either, because typically what happens is one person gets appointed. You can't see my air quotes, appointed
I like
to do everything. That's not fair either.
Yeah, it's really being able to share that responsibility.
Right. Exactly.
So when we look at, the transition of their parent had previously been making all of the decisions, and it sounds like they're wanting to take some of those over. It's understanding that there could be possible medical reasons why they would need to do that. Mm-hmm. So understanding that would be, let's say, the benchmark of now it's necessary for the children and the caregiver to make those decisions. If it's a necessary decision, how is the best way to do that versus, well, I'd like to make their decisions. So if we're putting those in two different camps,
right.
If we start with the first one, now they have to make those decisions, and how can they transition a little bit easier?
I think in general I think more communication is better than less. So to sit down and have an honest conversation about how things are going to flow, how decisions are going to be made. Maybe you make them together as a group and somebody's not always going to be happy and there's some compromise in between there. So, the worst thing that happens is that you're taking somebody else's freedom away about making a decision, or maybe you think yours is the only right decision. And there can be an ebb and flow, because not every person has the exact right decision. Mm-hmm. There's usually some compromise in between. And so trying to find a compromise to step your way to eventually, you might have to make all the decisions. For example, if you have a parent or a loved one with a dementia or a stroke or Parkinson's, you might be the one that has to make all the decisions, because then you would have the power of attorney, you would have the power of healthcare to be the decider. And that's different than somebody just coming in and ripping those decisions away because they think you're making the bad ones. Mm-hmm. So I think that's key.
So then for the other side, for people that see their parents or their loved ones aging and, have different challenges, and they really want to step in and make life easier and not have them struggle, but while wanting them to maintain their independence, are there any guidelines that we should look to loosely? I guess we'll make up those guidelines, but would that benchmark be safety is what I'm guessing, that we want to step in when we see that safety is at risk?
Yes, I would say that's a fair statement. And, struggle is an interesting word. I struggle with decisions all the time.
Hmm.
Some decisions that I make probably are good ones, and some I probably shouldn't have made, which makes me struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that older adults can't make mistakes. Now, obviously, there's safety and security and fraud and all those kinds of things that you need to look out for, because some older adults tend to be more vulnerable than others. That doesn't mean others aren't vulnerable, but
Yeah.
they're usually targeted. But sometimes it's okay to make hard decisions, and sometimes the struggle ones, there aren't many good choices.
Mm.
And so I would say look at each individual decision that they're making in kind of a different light and say, okay, what other decisions could have been made? Did it result in harm to themselves or others? Sometimes the other things that happen is you'll have a sibling from another state come in that doesn't see the loved one as often, and all of a sudden they'll see a completely different viewpoint of the person, and sometimes take a stronger role into saying, oh, this and this and this and this happens, when the people on the ground who are seeing them every day are helping them work through this. And so it adds to tension. But again, to treat them like an adult, to make sure that the decisions they make are not as detrimental, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But it's okay to make bad decisions.
That is so insightful, because if we look at, right, if we're being self-reflective and if all of our decisions were looked at in our life, and if someone were to look and judge all of our decisions, the good ones and the bad ones, and that we had fear around any bad decision that we would make would cause us to lose our independence, that is really stressful. And so that is so important to look at, is that we all in any age make good decisions and bad ones.
Right.
And
I tell
struggle
my
is a
son
part
this.
of life, and okay.
That's right. Exactly. And I tell my son, I said, it's obviously we all want to make good decisions all the time, but that's just not realistic. And the bad decisions are the ones that you make the decision at the time and you think it's going to turn out okay, but it turns out not to be a good decision, but you learn from it. The decisions you want to stay away from are the stupid decisions, the ones that you know in your gut is not the right decision, and you do it anyway, knowing that it's not going to work out the way you intended.
Right.
And so if it's those decisions, or they're deciding things that are uncharacteristic of what they used to decide, then you might want to take a different viewpoint of that particular decision. And you might want to, as a family, kind of wrestle with, oh, this doesn't sound like mom or dad. They would never have done this in the past. What's going on? You know?
And that's key, to really look at those uncharacteristic decisions, and that's out of character for your loved one. And that's when you can really have that conversation and make some tough decisions on your end as a family member of what to do.
Right. Exactly.
Thank you, Renee. So insightful. And I think we had a really good dialogue about that question. And again, just a reminder, if anyone listening has a question, email us. We'd be happy to dive into any of those topics. We want to hear from you. We want to talk about what you want to hear. So thank you. Thanks again, Renee.
Thank you, Nicole. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.